Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar about the guidelines for minimizing recreational impacts to ecological resources on ANR lands. We'll just wait a little bit for more folks to join, maybe just a couple minutes. Share my presentation, maybe. It looks like more people are coming in. Just give people one more minute. Hi for everyone joining. We're just waiting another minute for people to come in. This is the webinar about the guidelines for minimizing recreational impacts to ecological resources on ANR lands, also called the Rec Eco Guidelines, and we're just looking forward to talking with all of you about it today. 10:02, so let's get started. I'll let people in as we go. My name is Claire Polfus, and I serve as the Recreation Program Manager for the Department of Forests, Parks, and Recreation. And we're here today to talk about these new guidelines that are going to be informing work on state lands going forward. Many of you have seen them before because we did reach out for input earlier on in our process. The guidelines were signed in December and are now being used by our district stewardship teams across the state. So we're just going to provide an overview, but first, I just want to introduce my colleagues who are going to be presenting with me today, or they can introduce themselves. Jim, you want to go first?
Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Duncan. I'm the State Lands Manager in the Division of Forests with Forest Parks and Recreation, and I oversee the 5 district stewardship foresters and the recreation specialists that work with them and support larger agency approach to land management.
Thanks. And Noel?
Hi, everyone. My name is Noel Dodge. I'm a wildlife biologist with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm the private land section chief, and I do primarily regulatory review outside of state lands, but also in state lands in the Berry District primarily. So,
Thanks, everyone. And just so everyone knows, we're going to be recording the first part of the webinar, the presentation part, but we're not going to be recording the questions and answers when we get there. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about how we got here, how the guidelines were developed, the framework that we're using within the guidelines, what the guidelines actually say, the steps for implementation, and then next steps in our work to continue balancing recreation and ecological values across our state lands. So how did we get here? About 5 years ago, folks at ANR identified the need for better resources in assessing the impacts of recreational infrastructure on ecological resources on state lands, and in particular about wildlife impacts. So the goal was to consolidate the knowledge about those potential impacts and the strategies to minimize them in one place rather than having to hunt around and look for what is really a growing body of scientific knowledge about the impacts as well as the minimization strategies. And then the other need was to figure out how to better address those impacts during our existing review processes within our state lands management frameworks. So that includes both our LRMP planning or long range management planning and our pre-proposal, proposal, or recreation project review process, as well as internal processes for our recreation management. So in 2023, I think, if that's right, the ANR Lands team, which is comprised of directors from our land managing departments, Fish and Wildlife, Forest Parks and Recreation, and the Department of Environmental Conservation, approved a working group to develop these guidelines. The working group was comprised of recreation managers, wildlife biologists, ecologists, other land managers, foresters, from across the departments of Fish and Wildlife and Forest Parks and Recreation. They met over the winter and then drafted the guidelines. They got feedback from the district stewardship teams across the state, feedback from partners, feedback from that lands team that I had already mentioned, and then finally feedback from our leadership here at ANR. And that took 2 years, but they were signed by Secretary Moore at the very end of 2024, and now they're ready to implement. I'm going to pass it over to Noel for these slides.
Yeah, thanks. So we went through this process inside ANR to get this feedback and get this document prepared and ready and reviewed. And so now here's some just sort of high-level overview points on the guidelines themselves. They were really considered to be, directly applicable to state lands. So, and as we discussed earlier, to be, applied when we're considering recreation projects within the DST review process. So now that these have been signed and approved, they will be included in existing planning and management processes moving forward. Hopefully, as Claire pointed out, this will sort of streamline and consolidate all the information in one place to make the process a little smoother. Again, intended for ANR Lands, not meant to be hard and fast rules. Throughout the guidelines, if you've reviewed them, you'll see, a little bit of softer language. It's not thou shalt do this, thou shalt do that. It's let's take this into consideration and let's explore alternatives and different options for how to get a project approved. And as with most of our guidelines, we try to update them as new information becomes available. As Claire mentioned, there's a growing body of research in the area of ecological impact from recreation, and so we hope to continue to keep up on those scientific publications and research projects and add as things change to this document. Whoops. There we go. Sorry, I took control. I think maybe Claire tried to do that. So within the document, we have these two axes. There's really two here, even though it sort of shows 4 quadrants. In the center there, you have recreational value. So on the bottom, you have lower projects with lower recreational value, and at the top, you have projects with a higher recreational value. And the axis that goes left and right, you have ecological value. So on the left, the ecological value is low, and that's probably for the location of the proposed project. And on the right, the ecological value would be high. And so really this breaks projects and locations into these 4 quadrants, 3 of which are, summarized here as being, most likely to be approved without much issue in the top left, because they have low ecological value but high recreational value. And then on the bottom, the low recreational value, and you can either have projects that are least likely to be even presented because they don't have a high recreation value, or you have projects that have a high recreation value but a low recreation value and a high ecological value, which are least likely to be approved. In other words, they have the most potential issues. And so up in the top right, we have projects that most of this guidance is focused on that are likely to require an in-depth review and discussion. And so that's sort of the purpose of the document, is to lay out all the different resource issues and our preferred direction for each one. And so this is the framework that's been adopted really in this guidance document. It's been used by the EPA and federal wetland review for years. It's a pretty standard review framework, I would say, for the Department of Fish and Wildlife for a lot of our guidance for other permitting. And it's really avoid and minimize and then mitigate, and that's a stepwise process. So your first step is to look at where the project is proposed and evaluate the resource issues around it that may be there in cooperation with the department rec specialists, and see how you can best avoid any impacts that might come up. So that's the first step, and without that step, we sort of are skipping the line. So we want to make sure we follow these steps in order to first avoid impact if possible. And then number two, if avoidance is not practical, then minimize impact. So, there's always a variety of aspects to each project that can or cannot be changed, sort of depending on the nature of the project and the resource and the location that it's proposed. But minimization is an important step as well. If you can't completely eliminate or avoid impacts, then we need to try to minimize them and demonstrate that we're doing that. And then strategies to minimize should match the context of the situation. So we have a number of scales that we look at in this document, from sort of a landscape scale, connectivity and forest fragmentation, down to a very site-specific scale of a single trail that's not very long, for example, that could be moved or is a very important connector. And so try to use the minimization strategies to the same scale that is appropriate for the project that we're reviewing. And in that last slide and throughout the document, we mentioned when this action is practical. So what is practical? So when we're considering whether avoidance is practical, the stewardship teams should evaluate a range of factors related to the construction management and long-term sustainability of the recreation resource. So again, there's always a large number of variables associated with a project. If you just look at the ecological side of it, there's a large number of variables. And then if you look at the recreation side of it, the proposed project, there's a large number of variables. So this is really a reminder to just take them all into account. And we have some examples at the bottom there: user experience, cost to do the work. How, is the trail that's proposed very far away from anywhere you can get equipment in there? Is that going to cost a lot of money to change? Or if not, maybe there's an alternative that would avoid some impact. And likewise, physical constraints, and then public interest. So just a reminder to try to really look holistically at all the different options and all the different impacts when making proposals. And that's how these guidelines really help us as the agency evaluate them.
So moving on to what the guidelines actually say. The guidelines are organized to match what our conservation framework, which is called the Vermont Conservation Design. And they move from general, applicable to many situations down to site specific. So general guidelines, we found there were some guidelines that just should be used across the board. These are things that are often like second nature to many recreation managers, but we also want to make sure that they're happening. And this includes like the management after a design is approved, right? And it is constructed, like the visitor use management, stewardship messaging, good information for users. All of that is included in the general guidelines because it doesn't really have a scale to it. But then when we get to the scales, we start with the landscape scale. And that's like the big picture. Where are there trails on the landscapes already? Where aren't there? Where are there important wildlife movement corridors? This aligns again with our Vermont conservation design. And it's generally like when you're looking at it where you might consider avoidance, primarily in the design phase, as well as minimization of like when you're conceptualizing a project, when you're starting to put the design into a mapping software, this is when you're looking at that landscape scale. Moving down a little bit further into the natural community scale or habitat, this is like things that you sometimes can see when you're on the ground, like a vernal pool or a wetland. But you might also be using this using mapping software. And this is kind of that in between where the minimization strategies or the avoidance strategies should be both in design and implementation as you're constructing the project. One important note here is some of these resources listed in the natural community section of the document also have regulations associated with them, particularly are like water resources like streams and rivers and wetlands. And none of these guidelines supersede any regulatory requirements. And that's just an important note. Then finally, we get to the site-specific scale. Sometimes this is in design phases, but a lot of it is in the implementation and construction phase. There's a lot of really well-established best practices for trail construction and design, and particularly around erosion control and water quality, which we know are impacts to ecological resources. We just know a lot more about how to minimize those impacts, and there are a lot of best management practice strategies already listed out there, and so we cite those in the document. So just to give you some more like actual examples, we're obviously not going to go totally through the guidelines today, but we pulled out an example of each scale to give you a little bit better idea of what we're talking about. So for the general guideline example, we pulled out to monitor and control for invasive plants at all recreation sites. Invasive trails and other recreation has been documented as a vector for invasive species. As people are moving through a patch of invasive species, they can transfer it in. You can create some edge effect from recreation infrastructure. And so our strategy is to control the species before construction begins, and especially concentrate on entry points like trailheads where there might be a little bit more of an open space that invasive species can get a better hold on. Moving to the landscape scale, again, this is using our Vermont conservation design. One of our strategies or guidelines is to avoid building trails and trail infrastructure in natural or man-made pinch points or bottlenecks within or between connectivity blocks and interior forest blocks. So we have an example here in between the towns of Stowe and Waterbury, where there's a big connectivity block to the west there and a big connectivity block to the east, but there's not a very good connection. It's a very narrow connection. So the reasoning for why to avoid building trails in these pinch points is that these are areas that are potentially already high stress for wildlife. They're potentially more susceptible to things like invasive species. And so we want to avoid those pinch point areas. And so in order to do that, you would want to consult the VCD maps, which are available online at BioFinder, and identify those during the project planning process. And for us, a lot of times that happens during our long-range management plan process. I just want to give you an example of like how this might look a little different in different places. So you saw the Stowe Waterbury example. This is an example from Groton State Forest. And that is a road going right, a state highway going right through the forest. And there is no pinch point in that area. That doesn't mean that you would want to like necessarily develop the whole thing by any means. There's other guidelines about interior forests and protecting those values, but I just want to show that it doesn't necessarily mean that at any road crossing, there is a pinch point in terms of connectivity, and especially in a place where there's conserved land on both sides of the road. Going down in scale to the community scale, our example is of cliffs. So one of the guidelines is to avoid trails that parallel the top or the bottom of cliff systems, and to use spur trails to access the cliff system for views or for access to the cliff. Why would you do this? Cliffs can be really important habitat for nesting and denning. And those are times in wildlife, in like their life cycles that are particularly sensitive. And so you want to avoid too much interaction at those times. And so a spur trail can allow people to get the views that they want. And we all know that people really want views and to enjoy the outdoors, while also protecting those sensitive wildlife. So one way to implement this is like as you're designing a project with our rec specialist, and you know that there's a view somewhere, figure out how you can do a spur rather than the paralleling of the cliff that might have more impact. If you want an example of that, come up to the Northeast Kingdom. You can visit Mount Hoare, where there's a spur to the cliff, which is where this photo is from. It's quite enjoyable for people and protects those wildlife interests. And then finally, getting down to the site-specific example, as I said, there's a lot of established BMPs for constructing trails. There's a lot of research that has been done of what types of strategies help reduce erosion. And so like an implementation of that is like, as you're out there, like putting the flag line on the trail, you can use the undulations of the landscape to create grade reversals. So water is never moving fast enough to create erosion. So that's just one small example of the many strategies we use to manage water on our trail systems. Moving to Jim.
So with these guidelines now in place, we have also incorporated this into the recreation project review process, which we've provided a webinar on before. And I wanted to highlight kind of where these guidelines come into our processes that you are probably familiar with engaging with. So when the guidelines will be used for our partner projects, there's two areas I'll highlight. First is on that conceptual inquiry from the member of the public or a recreation partner. That conceptual inquiry would be a good time to look at the guidelines and the site and determine which might apply, and that might help with the development of that idea. And the rec specialist can help the partner understand the constraints and the opportunities that a location presents in the context of the rec eco guidelines. The second process is when we're in a full review of a recreation project where the pre-proposal or full proposal has been developed. These recreation eco and ecological guidelines can be used by all DST staff to identify any potential for conflicts with the other resources and propose potential avoidance and minimization options during each stage of the review. So it provides multiple points where feedback can be given, and we can work through the process to identify those approaches that might help minimize those conflicts. So the rec specialist, again, plays a key role in facilitating that, but all DST staff are able to use these guidelines with our recreation partners to review those projects. At other times, there's many other places where we would see these used within the agency when we have internally proposed projects by FPR or ANR staff. Those same guidelines can be used at project review when we do internal projects. And with our long-range management planning, there's also an opportunity to use these guidelines more broadly, looking at both the assessments of resources, recreational and natural resources, and developing land use classifications. Similarly, if there's going to be a long-range management plan amendment to accommodate or consider a different use, these guidelines can come into play. So from an internal perspective, FPR and Agency of Natural Resources has these other processes where you might see some utilization of these guidelines as a partner engaged in that process.
So we have the guidelines that they're now posted on our website. I sent them to you when in the invitation to this webinar as well, but we have them on our website at the page that has all the information about the recreation project review process. That is a QR code to that page, but you can also get to it if you go to recreation within our website and then the ANR Lands recreation project review process. I can drop a link in the chat in a second. If you have questions about these beyond today. Obviously, we have plenty of time for question and answer in just a few moments, but if you have questions about this for specific projects, most of you all will know your recreation specialist in your district. And if you don't, you can either contact me or someone else to get you that information. For statewide implementation questions, you can contact Jim, who's on this call, or for anything about your partnership and how this affects that or general guidelines, you can always contact me. So we're here to answer questions to help as we implement this in these guidelines. In terms of next steps, like as we said, we're integrating this into all of our review processes for this year. Next winter, we're going to be doing a review of how it went and whether the guidelines need any revisions or changes, or there needs to be any further resources to make it a smoother process, or clarify any of the guidelines that maybe were not written like we thought that they were clear, but maybe they weren't clear. So that will be happening next winter. As Noel said, like these are really very much intended for ANR lands. We know and have heard from partners that they're interested in how they could be utilized elsewhere. And one of the things that we are looking into is how to, what we would need to do to make this a more publicly accessible document that might be more applicable off of state lands. However, like they are intended to be used within our processes of discussion with experts in the field, and they're not really like designed or I think very easily implementable by people without that background. So that is on our minds, like we're thinking about it and like would use that review process next winter to consider whether that's something that we could start working on developing. With that, we can move on to your questions. So I am going to stop recording. And